Hello, I'm Father Robert Sirico, president of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty, and its co-founder. And this is the first time I've had an opportunity to address our audiences directly in this fashion. If these kinds of communications are of use to you, I hope you'll let us know, and we'll make more available. You may have heard that Pope Francis recently issued what is called an Apostolic Exhortation. It's a statement from the Holy Father. The title of it is Evangelii Gaudium, and it speaks about the joy of the gospel. There are some aspects of it that have to do with economic questions, and of course that's our area of particular interest here at the Acton Institute, so I'm going to zero in on some of those points. But I encourage you to read the whole 85-page document for a lot of insight on a lot of interesting things. Who better than the Pope, and this Pope in particular, to direct our attention to the poor who live very often in unacceptable circumstances, in misery, in concrete areas of the world where there is desperation. Who better than a religious leader to focus our attention on this, and in focusing our attention on this, to challenge us with some real serious obligations that we share. One of the first things you need to know about an apostolic exhortation is that it, in Catholic theology, does not occupy the highest place of magisterial teaching, but is nonetheless worthy of our consideration and real rich and deep and honest discussion. Now, when we look at this document, we see a variety of different concerns. But first and foremost in our mind is we need to understand that the Pope is not animated by political ambitions or motivations. He says this in the 208th paragraph of this exhortation, that he is not driven by a political ideology, that he's very sincerely expressing his concerns, and that he realizes the way in which he expresses some of these concerns and some of the things that he says might be, as he says, irksome to some people. Now, personally, I don't find the Holy Father's teaching irksome, but they do invite some questions. And so I very honestly and sincerely, with the same kind of motivations as the Holy Father, want to put forth a series of questions as we study this document that I hope will be helpful to you. The first among those questions that I have is, how are we to respond to his warnings about mere temporary responses to poverty, what he also calls in paragraph 204 the welfare mentality? How are we supposed to understand that with the demonstrable benefits that we see accruing to the poorest of the poor in the world for probably the last 100 or 150 years or so, which were made possible by markets globalizing? How do we square the temporary solutions that very often are imposed by political structures with these permanent structural solutions that we see being made possible by the fact that people have access to work in ways that they never did before, have access to goods and services, have risen out of the kind of desperate poverty, in fact, are even alive today because of the globalization of markets. Now, I perfectly agree with the Holy Father when he says that markets are not enough. Those of you who have been familiar with the work of the Acton Institute any length of time have heard the refrain over and over again: markets are necessary, but they are not sufficient. That's the whole reason we promote an idea, a philosophy of religion and liberty. Freedom in the economic sphere, along with a strong sense of moral responsibility. The Holy Father repeatedly warns against a misunderstanding of who human beings are, as well as the danger that he sees in markets that are unhampered. The question I have to that contention is, where are these unhampered markets? Certainly the global trade system is laden with many, many kinds of regulations. And who are the advocates of this kind of what might be called laissez-faire? I don't think he uses that term in the exhortation, but who is advocating a market without regulations, without law? In fact, the importance is to have the rule of law where markets operate, because that's the only effective way to ensure that they are operating. Certainly, it would help to have an elaboration on the rule of law at some point in this exhortation or in a future exhortation, which this particular exhortation does not address. Another very interesting thing that the Pope mentions in this letter, and almost uses a phrase that we use quite a bit. I call it the entrepreneurial vocation, but he talks about business as a vocation in this letter, in the 203rd paragraph. And he says, in praising business as a vocation, a noble vocation, he says, he speaks about meeting the needs of the common good by striving to increase the goods of this world to make them more accessible to people who are in need. Now, that's a description of the kind of markets we here at the Acton Institute certainly talk about. My question is, how do we see or hear these clear warnings when he also speaks in the paragraph right before that about the absolute autonomy of markets? Where is the market absolutely autonomous? Who is advocating for a market disconnected from law, from morality, from culture? And indeed, when Pope Francis speaks about these matters, can there be a distinction between the free economy that Blessed John Paul II spoke of in his encyclical Centesimus Annus, and the things that Pope Francis is seeing as a kind of crony capitalism or state capitalism, with which he undoubtedly would have been familiar in Argentina in particular, or really throughout much of Latin America? Elsewhere on this website, you will find a number of resources that deal with the question of poverty, both in written form and in video form. I want to call your attention in particular to the curriculum, a new series that we've put out called Poverty Cure. In this series of inquiries into the cure for poverty, we go all over the world to speak to those who are precisely the kinds of people that Pope Francis has expressed such an ardent concern for. We see them in their working conditions, in their lives, in the circumstances that make their lives difficult. And we ask them to tell us what makes their lives difficult, what impedes their ability to produce sufficient resources for themselves, their communities, their families, and other people. I had the privilege of placing that series, that curriculum, in his hands when I visited the Holy Father this summer. And I wonder if he could agree with this kind of approach that we're having, that trade can be designed in a way that people actually get to know one another, where it builds communities, and that this is a preferential option for the poor, if you will, over and above the kind of aid programs that he has spoken of in so many circumstances that have held the poor back and that have benefited people who are already involved in markets and politically powerful people. Could he see that our God-given creativity unleashes this noble vocation of business to not merely benefit oneself, but to benefit the poorest of the poor? And also, I wonder if, in the Pope's concern for unfettered markets, he would share, and I'm sure he does because I know what the Catechism says, and I know that he's a faithful son of the Church, but could he articulate his concern that there are unfettered governments as well, that bureaucracies can be unfettered, distorting markets in the form of state capitalism or crony capitalism, and distorting welfare programs that debase people and fail to see the natural and God-given creativity that people have? Could he see, along with Lord Acton, that power does indeed tend to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely? I also hope you'll take some time to really explore and read and go into depth with this Apostolic Exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, which will, I think, enrich your own life spiritually and really challenge you in your prayer life as well. Thanks for watching. Thanks for visiting acton.org, and be sure to look up povertycure.org.